Well, hello tonight, and welcome everybody to Nightlight. That was the magical voice of Ken Quiet Hawk, inviting you to come in out of the mainstream and join us for a time to be sheltered from the storms of evolution and change, that which we laughingly call creation. Come in and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and, with a little luck, some wisdom. These are times of change, times that call to the seekers, and you answer that call from all walks of life and from countless aspects of the spiritual realms. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading your wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. This is my own very private oasis in the turmoil we call evolution, so sit back, take a break, take your shoes off. Share your lights with us and join in the love, the light, and the laughter that spiritual energy always generates when lights are blended and spirits lifted. I'm Barb DeLong, your host, and along with Deb and tonight my guest, Dennis Stone, we welcome you in and hope you'll add your lights to ours to increase the energy and brighten all of our own personal lights. Ken Quiet Hawk can be found at nativestorytellers.com if you want to experience more of that voice. I'm at barbaradelong.com, and Dennis is at stonehengeusa.com. I'm really very, very excited about tonight's program because it surrounds, it evolves, it is focused on a topic that is near and dear to my heart. Patrick and I, for a very long time, did everything we could to draw attention to the stone walls and stone chambers that proliferate New England, and tonight's guest owns one of the biggest sites out there. He is the owner and caretaker of American Stonehenge. It's a 4,000-year-old prehistoric site in Salem, New Hampshire. It is a massive man-made formation with chambers, walls, ceremonial meeting places, stones that are what's the word I'm looking for? Positioned for the equinoxes and the solstices. It's one of the most incredible. I guess I would call it it's almost like a village, actually, and it is the biggest assemblage I have ever seen, and I have been all over the place and seen hundreds and hundreds of individual chambers. It is the most profound. I've put some of them in the scroll at the top of the show page to show some of these chambers, and they are amazing. Now, Dennis Stone grew up at America's Stonehenge and has been involved with the site for the last 55 years. And during that time, he's met a tremendous number of people, famous and so forth. He's also a full-time airline captain, and he's traveled extensively around the world to ancient sites in Europe and North America. And the site itself is amazing, and happily, hopefully, we can bring more and more attention to it so more people can experience it. It's been my feeling, my thought, and my fear that these sites, because they don't get enough publicity, are basically being lost into obscurity, and the schools, the teachers, the powers that be don't feel that it's necessary to examine them and to use them and to incorporate them into the history of our country, and they're very important. So I want to welcome Dennis Stone to the show. Dennis, welcome to Nightlight, and thank you so much for being here to share your experiences and your time and your wisdom with us.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for having me on this evening. I really appreciate it. And I was looking forward to this show with you about these very strange sites, and thank you for having me on.
Well, I think that of all of the stone structures and the stone places that I experienced over the last 5 years especially, America's Stonehenge was the most profound because it's so much in a very small space, and normally you don't find that many chambers or structures or whatever. It's almost like it's the capital of all of them. And go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yes, it does have a high density of structures, and that was very well put about the how many different chambers are in one area. That is correct. Yeah.
They and for those who don't know what we're talking about, Dennis's website, I think you have some pictures of them, and I think on my website with Secrets of the Stones, I have a lot of pictures of American Stonehenge there as well, so that you can get an idea as to what we're talking about. These are what would you call them? They're stone structures. They're caves, kind of like, but they're man-made. They're made with no mortar or anything like that. It's called dry stone construction, and many of them are made with corbelled ceilings, so that it is a very difficult form of construction, and it's not exactly one that the colonial farmers were schooled in before they got on the ship and came over here. They have been. It's been suggested that there are a number of different things, none of which they are. So, do you have any idea as to what they were used for?
That's the million-dollar question. What was the site built for? A lot of effort and a lot of time went into the planning and construction of the site. We think the site, it's on a very large hill. It's about 360 feet above sea level. It's not the highest hill in that area, but it's one of the higher hills. And we're about 40 miles north of Boston and about 21 statute miles from the ocean. But we think the site possibly was used for religious purposes. It was called, as a matter of fact, you mentioned the word village, and over the last century, people referred to it as different things. And one of the words or names they called it was the Great Stone Village of North Salem. Today, we feel because of the amount of artifacts that came out of the site, it looks fairly clean archaeologically, and the structures are kind of small. A lot of work went into building them, but they don't really look like homes or habitat. Again, if it was, we'd find a lot more refuge from when the people were living there. It's fairly clean. We have found stone tools, utensils, possible weapons in the archaeological excavations. But we think it's a sacred site or a spiritual place, and possibly some of the structures are also used for burial chambers. And we're still studying that, but it does have resemblance to some of the sites throughout New England, as well as European megalithic-type sites, too, which tend to be tombs, temples, and monuments, but those are probably good guesses, or maybe they're just guesses. We really don't know exactly what all of those were used for either. So we're still studying the question as to why they went through all that trouble to build this site. We even had a number of man-hours, an estimate by a stonemason at one time. I forget the figure of how many hours went into building the site, but it was quite a few.
Yeah, I can imagine. And the other thing that most people don't realize is that these stones, they weren't just the kind of stones you would pick and pull out of a field. Many of them weigh 13, 14, 15 tons. Which is a little more than a couple of men could lift.
That's a really good point too, Zach. That's a very good point. Yeah, these stones were actually taken from the bedrock. They were actually removed, and it's still a mystery as to how they could move some of these stones. I think the biggest roof slab we have there is 14 tons, almost 30,000 pounds, and there are others of different sizes and smaller, but. How were they able to extract it from the bedrock? The bedrock does come up in layers. They call it foliated, but it's all granite. It's very hard, and it is somewhat difficult to do this unless you really know what you're doing. So they were expert, apparently, and able to lift these big slabs and the whole hilltop, basically. We find these stones still out there in situ. They were just sitting there. We think they had a much bigger plan for the site. And recently, my son was out there doing work. His name is Kelsey. And about 2 years ago, he found many more of these big slabs. They were propped up artificially. They were actually lifted off the bedrock, somehow split in the bedrock, and then they were propped by another stone. And in the 1970s and 80s, we knew of about a dozen, but he found probably another 15 of them out there recently. So we think they had a much bigger plan for the site, and it was a work in progress. And that became, in our minds recently, was, wow, they had bigger plans, but what happened to these plans? What happened to these people? Why did they stop? That became kind of a big mystery to us also.
Well, I kind of when we were looking into it, we were trying to find out historically who had any claim to having built them. And I know that in the early 1600s, one of the colonialists wrote a letter to the then governor of the province of I think it was New Hampshire or Connecticut or wherever it was, and asking who had built the stone chambers because they didn't know. And we looked back into the indigenous Indians because, first of all, the indigenous Indians were not stone masons. They didn't construct dwellings out of stone. They constructed their dwellings out of mostly logs and branches and animal skins and things like that. So they had lodges, but they were built with wood. And so the further back we went, the more we realized that the Native American Indians that came to this country, this continent, came over the land bridge 15,000 years ago. And those stone chambers were there then. So it then you step back and you say, well, who built them and where did those people go? And you almost want to put them into the same class as the Anastasi, who disappeared, and we have no knowledge of where they went. And to me, many times I keep thinking, was there a race of people that were here and lived here and then disappeared all of a sudden, and they just left everything behind? And more and more, it's coming. It's becoming very clear that this was a large community of people that suddenly disappeared. They didn't suddenly take up residence as another kind of person. They created that site for a reason, and there was so much work that went into it. They wouldn't have left it unless there was a real good reason. And
exactly. I think you're going back to the beginning of what you were saying. That I think it was Governor Winthrop of Connecticut, I believe, was written to by a guy named John Pynchon. And I think it was 1654. I know it was like 300 years before my year of my birth. I remember that was like 300 years before that, asking a question who had built some stone constructions down there. And I think they were referring to Gunjawam, possibly. That's my best understanding of it. So even our early forefathers were questioning what these things were doing there. That's just one example of that, So they may not have been building it, as some people suggest. That's one of the theories that our forefathers built all of these structures, That seems to be an easy explanation, but it may not be the actual truth, of the origins of these structures.
Well, you kind of sometimes when they're writing history books, if they don't have an explanation, they make up a reasonable story and they sell it to us, and then it becomes carved in stone, so to speak. And nowhere in any history book have I taught school, so I found nothing in any of the history books about the stone chambers and the stone walls that are all over New England. And I've been in probably, well over 100 of them. And I know at one time the count was more like 2,000, but it's down to closer to 200 now. People just, because nothing is said about them, they don't feel guilty about taking them down and using their stones for patios and such. And it's happened a lot down here. And people, you don't see the number of chambers any place else but in New England, and Stonehenge has got to be, my gosh, the star in the whole thing, because the number of chambers you've got there, the number of structures, the fact that you have the astrological alignments all over the place, it's profound. I mean, they clearly knew their astrology, they clearly knew their positioning, and now the Stonehenge, just the compound itself is how many acres?
The main site with most of the features, and it does have a chain link fence that's surrounding it to protect it. It was put up by the British researcher in 1936. That area is about 1 acre. And then the walls, you mentioned the astronomical alignments, that's about between 15 to 20 acres. And we have about 110 acres protected. So pretty much the whole hilltop and it does have features all over the hilltop. So there's about 110 acres of different, including those quarry sites. We have a workshop area we found in the mid-'90s where somebody was bringing material in from Massachusetts to make stone tools. I think it was rhyolite. We identified its source. And we have a glacial cliff shelter, and we have a place where they found a wigwam. And so the whole hilltop has features. So there was human activity going on all over the hill, basically. But the main site's about 1 acre, and then the alignments are approximately something like between 15 and 20. I think somebody said like 18 acres is what the alignments are. If you know that area that they cover, So it's a pretty good sized area. Yep.
Well, for those, and it's probably most, who are not as fanatical about the stone structures as you and I are, you want to explain to them just a little bit what the alignments mean, what they are?
Yeah, the site is, we call it America's Stonehenge, and it was a nickname that actually started in 1959, 1 year after we opened to the public. My dad opened it. His name was Robert Stone, and he got involved with it in the mid-1950s. But he opened it up, and the next year, in 1959, the Saturday Evening Post did a story on us. We were featured in that. We still have a couple of copies of that. And that was really nice for us. It was the second year we were open. We were kind of struggling with the business back then. And they mentioned at our site, they called it the Stonehenge of America because they saw the big stones at our site, the large stones, and they compared it to Stonehenge in England. But they did not realize, and we didn't realize at the time, that there were actually alignments of the sun, moon, and stars. That work didn't begin until 1967. 1965, Gerald Hopkins' book, Stonehenge Decoded, came out and became very, very popular. And a CBS special about Stonehenge came out, and that was kind of because of that book. And when we saw that, we knew that there were stones surrounding the main site out in the woods, way out in the woods, hundreds of feet from the main site. These are standing stones and also kind of arrowhead shaped, and some were standing, some were fallen. And even back in the 1930s, the first researcher kind of noted them but didn't know what they were, and his focus was on the main site where we put up a chain link fence to do research and protect the site. So we began clearing out some of the trees. We thought, well, maybe these stones might have an astronomical purpose. So in 1967, we began clearing the trees to what we call the winter solstice sunset stone today. And 1967, the weather, I guess during that, you can actually watch it for a few days before and a few days after. The weather didn't cooperate. So in 68, 69, we had weather problems. By 1970, I was there with my dad and a neighbor and a general manager at the time. And we all went up the whole day, and the sun was out, and the clouds were very few, which was excellent. And we actually watched and we photographed the whole sequence of pictures of the sun setting right over that stone. And we wondered if we were like the last time that happened could have been thousands of years ago. So we may have been the first people to watch that in many, many years, And we realized that, yes, it looks like it is astronomically aligned. So in the early 70s, we decided to clear out more of the alignments. And by the early 70s, by 1973, we realized we needed to have a professional survey team come in and survey the standing stones and the ones that fell and the walls also. And by 1977, we had enough of the survey done, and they sent it to the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And when we got the results back, it was really interesting. They said that, yes, if the site was used for astronomical purposes, watching sunrise and sunset, moonrise, moonset, etc., that the site won't work today. The Earth's tilt is very slowly changing, and it's a 41,000-year cycle. So they said if you wanted it to work, you'd have to go back to about 1800 BC, plus or minus about 2 centuries, to make it work. And that was like, wow, that's the same period as the oldest carbon dating that was taken in 1971 on the main site. So the carbon dating and the astronomical dates seem to support each other. And that was really something. That was in 1977. What we found out, we have alignments with the sun for the quarter days, which are seasons, and the cross-quarter days, which happen to be like the Celts used to celebrate, like May Day, November 1st. They called it Samhain and Samhain, February 1st, and August 1st. And those are very important on the ancient Celtic holidays. Those are called cross-quarter days. So we have those solar alignments, and then we found we have the lunar alignments with the 18.5-year moon cycle. And they told us we had 24 star alignments. We had no idea. We knew we had one alignment with the true north, with Polaris, the pole star today, and just 4,000 years ago, there was a different star in that position called Thuban or Alpha Draconis. We didn't realize we had 23 other star alignments, and that's something we're still working on today. So we have a sun, moon, star, and functionally it's similar to Stonehenge in England. And so the name was changed in 1983 to America Stonehenge, and that's how we get that name today.
Well, it certainly has earned it. I mean, my grandfather visited Stonehenge in England in the early 1900s. I think it was about 1908, 1909. And I have pictures of Stonehenge. I have pictures that he took. And it doesn't look anything like it looks today. They had those stones, braced up with great big pieces of timber and everything. It was a rather pathetic looking pile of rocks. So it is definitely, it looks much better now than it did then. I think one of the things that impressed me so greatly was when I did visit your site, and it was about 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, in there someplace. First of all, it feels like it's nestled in the woods, and when you look around at the trees that are there, they're not huge trees. They're not trees that look like they're more than maybe 100 years old, maybe 100 years old, maybe not even that old. But it looks like, when I say reasonably new growth, I mean 100 years or so. And I know the Native American Indians used to do clear burning, but my feeling was that site was much older than that. Now you've done the carbon dating, and that takes it back to about 2,000 years BC, right? In there someplace.
That's correct. Yep. Yes. Yep. Absolutely. Yep.
So at that time, it would seem to me that at some point in time, all of the area around there had been cleared. Now I don't know when, but and so I'm wondering, are you going to begin clearing more and more to see if you can find any other structures there?
That's possible. Yeah, we did clear out most of the alignments I mentioned with the sun, moon, and that one star. As we do more research, there may be a possibility of opening up more alignments. We have thinned out the woods. We did work with the Forest Extension Service a couple of times from the University of New Hampshire, how to maintain the forest, as well as, we need to have clearings here so we can see the alignments too, And so I think that will happen. I think we'll probably end up, my son recently, he was he was finishing his engineering degree. It was between semesters, and we come to work there 2 years ago, reopening up a lot of the clearings. They're starting to fill back in after over 40 years. Some of them were opened in 67, as I mentioned. And he went through and had a couple of assistants up there helping him, and they did a really nice job. And boy, they did open up the alignments pretty nicely, so you can really see them really good. That's an ongoing process. And I think we may have to, we have 23 other star alignments, so maybe a couple of those we'd have to open up too. It is a lot of work, though. You have to clear about somewhere around 700 or 800 feet of trees, and it's fairly wide too, So it's a lot of firewood when we get done with it, And make the woods look nice up there. So we try to balance that, with keeping it kind of a little bit woodsy too. I don't think people had that problem with the trees, though, as you were getting to. Yeah, I don't think those people had that problem 4,000 years ago with the trees necessarily.
Well, actually, the reason I asked is that what we noticed with a lot of the chambers that we were going in and investigating, that the leaves the leaves fall, the trees fall, they disintegrate, they get incorporated into the soil, and you get layers and layers and layers and layers and layers of those, hundreds and hundreds of years of it. And we found that with the few chambers that we went in that nobody was looking, we took shovels. And we dug as far down as we could, and sometimes we got down as much as 3.5, 4 feet, and the stone chamber went down that far. So I'm wondering if, thousands of years of trees growing and then collapsing and then molding into dirt and everything, have you ever used any ground penetrating radar to look for any other structures that might be hidden there?
Question. Yeah, actually, We have, and it was in the 1990s, and we'd love to have them back up again. It was actually a company that was a neighbor of ours, about 1/4 of a mile from our entrance, and they use equipment all over the world, and the company was Geophysical Survey Systems, and they were one of the companies that make that ground penetration radar. And they were coming over to our place in the mid-90s working with our archaeologist, who was a past president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society, and they were running the radar over different features that we knew, and they were running it over other areas that we did not know as a comparison, looking at underground drains, chambers, that type of thing. And they found a couple of fire pits up there using that. And one thing we never got back to in the mid-90s was to the west of our main site, outside the fence, probably about 200 feet from the main site, they came across a big cavity, and we thought it was solid bedrock because the whole hilltop's a big piece of bedrock pretty much. And they said, you have a cavity down here, and they said the size of it was about the size of what we call the chamber in ruins. It's a rectangular chamber, and it's in the website, but it's very similar in size to that. And they said it's down here. We don't know if it's natural. We don't know if it's man-made. And we have never gone in and dug down to see if there's a chamber there. I think what we have to do is do it correctly. We have to have the right person, we have to have it controlled, not somebody just up there with a shovel digging away, So it has to be done carefully. But that's exciting to us, It's something that's been about 16 or 17 years since we knew about that. And since that time, that moved downtown Salem, and we kind of lost contact with them. And I know their equipment is really advanced now, these laptops, and they can actually, their equipment's so, and the software is so advanced that if it's like arrowhead in the ground, they can actually see the shape of their head, not just a bunch of ziggy lines that they interpret, It's almost like X-ray vision now. It's getting better and better. So it's a really good tool. We need to use it up there more. We only have excavated 1 acre out of the 110 acres. If you put all the test pits together, we've done since the 1930s, only about 1% of the hilltops been looked at. And the ground penetration radar, we did run it over quite a few different areas, but not the entire hill, of course, So I would love to do more of that up there.
The other thing I was curious about, you mentioned a while back artifacts. What kind of artifacts have been found there? Because if they had actually been living there, there would be pottery and stuff like that. And from what I remembered, and my memory isn't perfect, that they were able to carbon date the fire pits, but not much else.
Right, organic material. We did 16 carbon datings up over there on the site since 1966. And we have found tools, and some were found as early as the 1930s when the archaeological work began. We have found both historic artifacts from the period and also prehistoric artifacts, such as hammer stones, rubbing stones, stone scrapers, stone wedges. We have a beautiful stone hoe. We have axe heads, adze, I believe a celt, and many stone artifacts basically that have been found there. And some of the pottery, we have found pottery there. There is a large clay deposit. It's near what we call the lower well. And that clay is, when you dig, it's in a swampy area, and they have excavated that. And when they went down, they found, you just go below all the dirt, and it's very black, muddy kind of soil, and all of a sudden you hit this white clay. It's just like white. It's amazing. It's so bright. It's so white, it's right there. It's right in there. And that might have been used for making that pottery, because right next to that swamp we found pottery grit, and they found, I guess, some evidence of burning there, where they were actually heating, and firing the pottery. So we think we might have found a little pottery factory, if you will, by the lower well. The glacial cliff shelters, where we found the largest pieces of pottery, some of that dates to almost 2,500 years old. It's Middle Woodland period pottery. And they did find pottery on the site, some of it, again, from the historic period. But they also found some other pieces up there that they couldn't identify. And so some people speculated it might be old world European, that these people brought with them. I don't know. We don't have an answer on that. That's something I think they'll have to do more, study on, that might be something interesting with all the modern technology that's out there now.
Well, there were some pictographs found there, too. I know Barry found you found some, and Barry Fell said that they were from in Ogham. Is that what he said they were?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. In 1964, that chamber in ruins I referred to earlier, they were trying to take the roof slab that had fallen into the structure sometime in the past. There may have been an earthquake. It's about a 7-ton stone, and it has that structure is really interesting because of the design of it and everything. It's right in the middle of the site, and it's orientated true north, south, east, west, and the longest part of it is running north and south. Near the top of the structure, there is core belling on it, on the top corners, which we've never seen before. So it's kind of an unusual technique. And our master stonemason, we were just talking to him about the fall project. We may be attempting to do what they did in 1964, which they didn't have the resources, they didn't have the equipment or time, but they're trying to take the roof slab and the stone lintel that fell in and get that out of there and excavate the structure and maybe restore it. As they attempted to do that in 1964, they found 2 stone tablets in the structure, and it had markings on them, and they did not recognize what these were at the time, and they went into our museum as unknown markings, and they sat there for about 11 years until Dr. Barry Fell from Harvard came up in 1975, and it didn't take him too long. He studied them at his home in Arlington, Mass., and he came back with results that one was Phoenician and the other one was Libyan. And I was like, wow, that was quite a eye-opener and quite a surprise for us, if that is in fact true. And so the third thing they found up there was Ogham, or Oham, they pronounce it differently. And that was found after Barry Fell's first visit. A number of us were up there doing some cleaning on the site, and now we're starting to look at these things, and there was this stone, and one of them had like a tic-tac-toe shape to it. Turns out it was a Celtic sun symbol for a ball or bell, I guess it would be the sun god Bel. And then they found a few other Ogham inscriptions up there also, and they're in display at our museum, and they're also in Barry Fell's book, which was written in 1976. It was called America BC, and he did a couple of updates until he died in 1994, and he also wrote Bronze Age America and Saga America. So on our site we have Phoenician, Libyan, and Ogham inscription according to Barry Fell.
Wow. Well, that, of course, you never know when somebody's going to come through and put graffiti on a wall someplace. So you can tell it goes back at least that far. The construction that is there, of course, without the mortar is, especially the corbelled construction. Last time that was actually used was in Phoenicia, and that was definitely about 3,000 years ago, 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. So it would stand to reason that some of their stonemasons may have been here. And like I said at the beginning of the program, our history books don't talk about any of these things. Columbus discovered America, and there were Indians here, and they, fed him corn, and he took them as prisoners. But that was about it. And the reality here is that not only were the Phoenicians probably here, but also the Norse were here, and according to some, the Templars were here too. So this was a pretty well trod upon planet before continent before Columbus claimed it for Spain.
Exactly. Yeah, some people thought Columbus was the first because Native Americans were already here, and then the original researcher at our site, William D. Goodwin of Hartford, Connecticut, he had a running battle with Samuel Eliot Morison, the famous naval historian from Harvard, and who coined the term NEBCO, No Explorers Before Columbus. And I think Samuel Eliot Morison died in 1976, roughly around that time period. It was quite a few years after they discovered the Vikings had actually landed up in Newfoundland, Canada. They established that. The National Geographic and the Early Sites Foundation proved the Vikings were here. So he said, yeah, they were here, and there may have been others, but that's not too significant. It's Columbus that, he gave pretty much most of the credit. So even at the end of his life, he started to admit there were others here, but that wasn't that important, It wasn't that relevant. But yeah, there was no explorers before Columbus, was what he believed, I guess.
Yeah, well, there go our history books yet again. There's so much that is left out that is so fascinating. I think one of my biggest pet peeves is when you talk about antiquity and ancient civilizations, they immediately go to Egypt and to Greece and Rome, and the reality is that we had civilizations that maybe even predated them, but there's no mention of that in the history books. I mean, the Native Americans, the Cherokee had a huge nation that went all the way down into South America, and they had amazing structures all over the place, and different from what you have there. And I think what you have at American Stonehenge is so unique and so different. It sticks out. It sticks out like a sore thumb, and it says, this wasn't what everybody thinks it was. And when you see that much of it together in one place, it's the other stuff is scattered all over New England, and it's at the side of the roads, and it's in fields, and it's all over the place. But what you have is such a concentration of the structures that it boggles the mind. I mean, I know that when we visited there, it was phenomenal, and the ones that you could walk through, even more so. They clearly were not dwellings, but what they were used for is, almost anybody's guest. And I sometimes, I know you've got one big rock and boulder. It's called the sacrificial table, and it does appear to have a channel all around the outside carved, and one would think it was to run off blood and stuff. But, you have no way of actually knowing, and it certainly wasn't a tabletop for messy eaters. I mean, there was definitely, a purpose for it, but I think what always boggles my mind is that when all else fails, make them bloodthirsty and make them sacrificing individuals and animals to their gods. And that's not necessarily true either. So, I mean, is there any other significant purpose that you could use that kind of a tabletop for?
Well, Mr. Goodwin, when he first saw this site in the 1930s, the table was there. You can see the top of it. The rest of it was buried right up at the top with earth. And as you mentioned earlier, how earth slowly builds up. And in New England, it's about an inch every 100 years. That's just an average, though, and you have erosion going on. It's for windblown dust and debris and vegetation decay and all of that. So the table was buried right up to the top, and there was about 2.5 to 3 feet of dirt there, and they thought it was resting on the dirt. And when his workers were up there cleaning, they were surveying the site, drawing pictures of the site. They had a MIT graduate, a guy named Roscoe Whitney. He used a plane table and did profiles and plan views of the site. And then as they went down, they were kind of shocked to find that it was sitting on legs. There were 4 legs under it. And I'm like, wow, that's really something, It's not just resting on the ground. And as they went down further, because they got to the bedrock, they found a cutout in the bedrock, right leg. And that's right where the runnel is. The table has a rectangular groove, as you mentioned, and it's about approximately 6 by 4 feet. Nothing's to English measurements, but Roscoe Whitney pointed that out in the 30s, that the site doesn't conform to our units of measure, rods, inches, feet, or anything like that. We couldn't figure out what they used for measurement on the site. We think it's megalithic units, but we've done some work on that, which is kind of maybe a piece of the evidence of who built the site. But that cutout's down there, and it's right below where the fluid, whatever it is, could drain into. It is a bell shape. It weighs about 9,000 pounds, so it's not a lightweight piece of stone. And we did identify where the quarry came out of. It came from about 40 feet north, and it's right below where the astronomical viewing platform is. There's a cutout that the stone came from, and we still can't figure out how they removed it from the bedrock unless they're using some sort of heating, like thermal shocking, building hot fires and pouring something along it to help crack it, because there's no metal tool markings at all that would have been used to, shape it the way it is. But some people suggest it's a slaughter table, an embalming table. Some people thought it might be a limestone for making soap. Most of the limestones I've ever seen you can pick up by yourself. They're pretty thin, and one guy could pick one up. I've seen them at a lot of these historic museums, and this thing's big. And
it's
also,
very big.
It is very big. It makes a lot of soap. Possibly cider-press. There's no archaeological evidence, historical evidence of this ever being used for making apple cider or apple jack or anything like that. So it could be ceremonial.
Where is the closest source of water to your site?
It's on the west side of our site on the hill. You get onto the bottom of the hill, you come upon the Spigot River. And the Spigot River, it's probably almost a half a mile from the top of the hill. And the Spigot River is a tributary of the Merrimack River, which goes out to the ocean. And so, so you have a bit of it'd be a ways and it'd be all uphill, for that anybody moving water.
You would sort of think that they wouldn't do anything quite that extensive without having a pretty close source of water.
Right. Yeah. That's the biggest source would be the Spigot River, and into the east of us is a few brooks and ponds, and we think if people came from overseas, how did they get to our site? They would have come up the eastern seaboard and then the Merrimack River, and then up the Merrimack up to a place called Haverhill, Massachusetts, and then they could either approach a site from the southeast. Today it's ponds and swamps and brooks. We think that was accessible, but it's all silted in today. The water levels have changed. Or the Spigot River, which is a little bit further to the west, and they could have come up right to the bottom of the hill pretty much. But at the mouth of the Merrimack in 2010, right at the mouth of the Merrimack, they're putting a homing somewhere in the vicinity of the mouth of that river, and they found a Phoenician coin. So that was kind of an interesting find, It's like, wow, maybe that's another piece of, if there was in fact somebody from overseas like the Phoenicians, something happened and one of the coins ended up in the ground there near the mouth of the river that would have been the gateway to our place.
Wow, that's phenomenal.
I
know that I was so taken aback by the feeling of your, I'm a sensitive and stuff like that, psychic and things, and I have found that the energy in and around the chambers is profoundly different than from walking across a field. I found that there is a different sort of energy in the chambers that I've been able to go in. You had most of your chambers, kind of chained off, so I couldn't actually climb in without getting yelled at. And the chambers that I've been in, it's almost like you feel safe and secure. There's a silence there. And have you found that? Have you found a different sort of feeling when you've been in the chambers?
Yeah, it's kind of a different feeling on the site when you get up there, and I'm not sure if I had that sensitivity, but it does feel different than, like I say, just walking in a different part of the countryside. It has a whole different feeling to it. Just when you're walking around, just that kind of sense you have. And we have had that kind of what you said by people that are, that clairvoyant or psychic. They've mentioned that many, many times over the years, that it definitely has a different feeling or energy to it, So I don't know if we've documented all of that. Sometimes we have had some documentation. Other than that, a lot of people just come up and tell us, Some of our visitors will come in and say, I feel a certain thing about the place, and it's definitely an energy, because we've had dowsers up there too, the American Dowsing Society president and all of them. They've been up there from the gentleman's in England right now. He was the president for a while. He's come down a number of times and bring groups of dowsers to our place, and they still come in. People still come in dows, and then we have in the fall, we have people come in and do, ghost hunts and bring all this equipment in there, and it's kind of interesting too. But people say there's a different feeling about the site, definitely. And they say that about some of the European sites too, that they visit these sites too.
Yeah, the thing that we found too is that some of them have some of the different sites have magnetic anomalies in the entrances of them. Have you found anything like that there? They
were using different, like pseudo compass up there, and they're doing survey work. And they did notice that the needle swings a bit, and we weren't sure if it was because of the large chain link fence that surrounds the site, or maybe there's something in the rocks, or other people say there's just, there's an energy up there too, because we have found quartz crystals in the what we call the upper well. We had mentioned the lower well down by the clay deposit, but the upper well is a shaft that's 22 or 23 feet. The bottom couple of feet actually go through bedrock. Somebody actually built a well of flat rocks, and then at the bottom somebody had quarried a few feet down into the bedrock, and our thought is that they were actually following a vein of quartz crystals, extracting them, because a lot of the ancient people used quartz crystals in their religious ceremonies. It was very important to these people, I guess.
Oh, yeah.
And we have found the quartz crystals are on display in our museum, so they say they have energy,
Well, how about now, I will step slightly into the paranormal. I know especially the stone chambers that are in the Hudson Valley, there is a tremendous, there's a tremendous amount of notably greater sightings of UFOs around those chambers. Has there been any sightings around yours?
We haven't really had any. I go up there all the time, and every now and then you see something, in the sky. Because I fly a lot, I've been flying for 40 years, and I'm always looking around for that because I have an interest in that. At our site, not that I'm aware of. We did have MUFON where I come up there and actually do some, evening, sits up there and watch. So they haven't done it yet. So that'd be kind of interesting to see if they, will see anything in particular. We were friends with Betty Hill. My mom became very friendly with her. She visited us, I think, in 1974 at the museum, and then they stayed in contact with each other until she passed away. But her story is very, very interesting, and so New Hampshire does have, some interesting UFO. And we did see something, my dad and I, coming down back in '66. We were riding along. We saw something nobody could explain, and it was in the papers the next day. It was right over Manchester, New Hampshire, not too far from our museum. And it was in the papers. Like, we thought we were the only ones that saw it. It was really unusual. We couldn't make out what it was. But I think even the control tower at the Manchester airport reported something on that. There's a famous incident at Exeter, and that's just down the street about 10 miles from our site. But I do know in Hudson Valley that show UFO hunters, they showcase a spot. They did a thing on that whole area down there a couple of years ago, and they showed some of the stone structures. And one of them had that tall monolith in front of it, in front of the entranceway. And I think that's on your documentary.
It is.
And it's a beautiful structure. And that was on TV. I had
my.
never seen that before. And they say there were UFO sightings in that vicinity. So
They're amazing. We do have a question from the queue. So can you take a question? Would that be okay?
I'll try to answer it. Sure.
Okay. Hi, Jay. You're on the air with Dennis.
Hey, Robert. It's Jay calling from Canada. How's it going?
Going
fine,
well.
Thank you. How you doing, Jay?
Hey, pretty good. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Bob, for letting me be a part of the show. My question is regarding, we have actually regarding the America's Stonehenge. I just wondered, do you see the shape of it as any sort of geometric pattern? And my second question is there some astrology or sign symbols of where this Stonehenge was actually built at a certain time period? And my third question is that does it lie on a ley line, just like the Stonehenge in Europe, and then we also have a medicine wheel that's on the same ley line as the one in Stonehenge in England. So I just wonder what your thoughts about that.
Oh, yeah, those are great questions. People have, in the 1970s, there's a book, it's out of print right now, it's called Puzzles and Stones. I think it came out in 1977, and it was all about America's Stonehenge. And there was a really well-done diagram of the walls, the standing stones, and the main site. And they found, by going from point to point to point, they found isosceles triangles, they found equilateral triangles, they also found a perfect circular, a perfect circle. And I'm trying to think what other patterns they found in that, but they found quite a few different patterns, different triangles, including the Pythagorean triangle, by going from a standing stone to another standing stone to another standing stone. And that was done, I could say, in 1977. And other people have looked at the shape of the walls, and one book that came out was by two authors, and they believed it looked like a map that would help guide people back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. And I'm not really sure. I have to admit a little bit of ignorance in how that worked. But also, if you look down at our walls, too, near the summer solstice, there's a shape of a wall pattern, and it looks just like the sacrificial table, the bell shape to it. You have to be pressed way up in the air to look down at it. And in the middle of it, there's this wall we call the bow tie wall, and it actually is astronomically aligned to, I believe it's a May 1st sunset. The end of the wall actually aligns with that. And it looks like a dagger in the middle of the table, which is kind of interesting, you know. And as far as ley lines, our site is aligned with a couple other sites nearby. True south of our site is a site called Turtle Mound in Andover, Massachusetts. If you look down at it from above, it looks like a big turtle. Nobody knows how old it is or who built it, but it's an effigy mound, and it's in a book called Weird New England. It has some beautiful photographs. I don't know if you can Google that. But that's true south of us. But there are so many sites in New England that I guess people would say to be bound to be, coincidences of these sites aligning. My son began doing more work on this because in the 1970s people were doing the same thing, looking at other sites to see if they aligned with our site. And they did find, besides Turtle Mound, they found several other sites in New England that were lined up. But my son, a couple of years ago, went beyond that. He went across the ocean, actually, and found that our summer solstice sunrise stone, if you do a line from our site, the center of it, through a stone circle, which is the observation point, through the stone itself where the sun rose over, and through a notch we call a horizon feature, which is about 5 miles from our site. And you go 3,200 miles, you're going to go right through the trilithon at Stonehenge. So more work has to be done on this. And he found some of the other alignments do align with other places around the world. And we just don't know if that's a coincidence or whether that's part of that sacred geometry or geography, you know. And I forget your other question now.
This is ley lines. I just wondered, in regards to what rock is that made of? Is it made of granite, or is it the rocks there, are they made of granite?
Yeah, it's mostly granite. There's quartz and there's quartz crystal. And there's actually a fault line that goes right through the center of the site. It's actually, we've had a few geologists up there. And the president of the New Hampshire Archaeological Society, her husband was a doctor of geology from Tufts University, as a matter of fact. We have other geologists up there. And that fault line goes up to the Clinton-Newberry fault line, which is kind of dormant, I guess. But it was a very, I guess in the past, in the ancient past, it was a very active fault. But the whole hilltop is split in half, and it's actually moved opposite a couple of inches. So you can actually see that on your tour. It's very close to the east-west chamber, if you happen to go and look at our website, and also a structure called the Bee Hut. It's right in front of those two structures. It's kind of interesting because you have the whole thing split and actually move. In the quartz, in the bedrock, we have both quartz and quartz crystal. But granite, yeah, it's foliated. It does come up in layers, and it's a very hard stone. I think it's 8 out of 10 on the hardness scale, so it's pretty hard to work with, actually. The whole hill is big granite outcropping, basically.
Interesting. That's interesting because, it seems like the ancients, like Egypt, they work with a lot of granite. And, look at this geometry of the pyramids. And, here you are talking about Stonehenge, America, and it's like a granite structure. And it's interesting that they knew something about how that interacts with the earth energies and, maybe doing, ritual or ceremony there to, do something with it, or harness the energies of the ley lines also. So it's very interesting.
That's a good observation. In our book, we do have a little bit of a section devoted to that, to the energy and why somebody may have chose that particular spot to build the site, and it had to do with energy and about the quartz, piezoelectric effect, and it goes into it much better than I can explain it. That's not my area of, expertise, if you will, but we do have an author from Florida that really does a lot of research in that area, and he's really good at explaining it. I'm not as good at explaining it, but there is a segment of the section of the book that really goes into that, and why did they choose this hill? And that's one of the areas they go into talking about that, the like the sacred geometry or sacred geography and the ley line and energy points and stuff like that. And earthquakes seem to play a part of that too.
Okay, well, I have a question here.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the largest stone at Stonehenge is bigger than the largest stone in the Great Pyramid at Giza. And I know that the stones, at least in New England, are granite with quartz in them. And, of course, we use quartz for communication. It was used, quartz crystals were used in radios at one point in time. So could this in some way have been a source, a way of communicating with places near and far, if somehow the quartz could have been energized so that it could have been used for that?
That's been talked about. In that, my dad worked at AT&T Bell Laboratories, and they used to grow those quartz crystals. Used to bring them home, the man-made quartz crystals too. And you're right, they were used for communications. And I think that's been talked about, theorized that maybe. Because most of these sites around, and I know around New England, like even some of the cairns will have quartz on top of them, right on top of the, and there may have been different reasons for doing that, and we don't know. But it seems to be something about energy. These quartz, the energy from the quartz, maybe something like you mentioned, But our site definitely has that. It does have the quartz, and it has the quartz crystal, and they were actually mining it, for a purpose. So. I know David Hatcher Childers in some of his books talks about that. Lost Cities of North America, we were in that book, but he talks about it around the world, how it seems to have played a part in a lot of these structures no matter where you go. There's something to do with quartz or quartz crystals. It seems to be, and even the crystal skull, the crystal skulls too, which we did see the, what is her name, Anna Mitchell Hedges. She came to our site. With that skull back around 1990, I think, roughly that. And she brought us her books, and we sold them for a while at our place. So we got to meet her, and her dad was an interesting person, I guess. He rode with Pancho Villa, I guess, and he was kind of the original Indiana Jones. And but she found that, I think, in Belize, I think. She's the one that discovered that skull, and it was a pretty cool skull, all made out of quartz. And she said people from, I forget if it was IBM or was another big corporation that does research and study, and they couldn't identify how somebody in the ancient times could have created that thing, with the tools, primitive tools, so.
Actually,
it was pretty cool.
Of late, they've just done an investigation of her skull and the one in the Smithsonian and the one in England and possibly the one in Paris, and they did find tool markings. So they are saying that they were made in the 19th century.
Are they saying that they're that was the thing. I was going to say there's some controversy surrounding that too, and some people think they were created back in the 1800s or something like that. So I don't know where the verdict stands, but maybe that's what and you wonder, did one person make all of them, or are they made? But maybe there's something that was fabricated then, So I don't know. I don't know what the final answer is.
Well, I don't. I think the court is still out, but every time you find something, there are going to be people that try to debunk it, and I don't know how thoroughly it's been debunked, but they're beautiful nonetheless,
Yeah, and like I say, you don't know if they've been proven to be hoaxes or whether that's still more of just another opinion, or it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. I think there were maybe 10 or a dozen of those, I guess, that were supposedly found, but I don't know. She truly believed in it, I know that, but I don't know who would have made those, but there is controversy behind them for sure. Just like even our site, there's always been controversy surrounding it. Is our site something fairly recent, or is it something ancient? Is it a hoax, as though somebody built it, for some purpose to fool the public, that kind of thing. That's been out there for many years too.
Well, what I thought was really interesting is that there is the foundation for a house there, so I think one of the previous owners decided to live right in the middle of the site, which was kind of cool.
You're right. Yeah, it was a Paddy family actually. Yeah, there was. We have people call the Paddies the farmers, and actually they were shoemakers, and there was a Peter, Richard, Seth, and then Jonathan, And it was Seth, the grandfather, that bought the land in 1734. That was even before Salem, New Hampshire was incorporated, which was 1750. And it was still part of Massachusetts. It was still part of the Haverhill, Mass. Part of Salem was Haverhill, part of it was Methuen, Mass. So Patty family, I think the grandfather bought the land, and he could have built the house or started the house, and then his son Seth was there, and then Jonathan, who we talk a lot about. It was Jonathan, we think, that actually had a lot of the site taken away during the 1800s. They were selling off the rocks to the Industrial Revolution was going on. They were making stone bridges, and they were using the stone for different types of purposes. And there were some estimates that maybe up to 50% of the site is missing today. And, it's during Jonathan's stay there when he was living there with his family. He had 2 sons and I believe 4 daughters. And later people said, well, it was all his 4 husky sons or his 6 husky sons. We have the names of his sons. There are 2 of them. One died as a teenager. And then he had 4 daughters. But, they said, well, he may have built the whole site. But actually they modified what was there. And you mentioned the cellar hole. You think that might have been a courtyard at one time. It has a couple of buildings surrounding it, such as the chamber in ruins, and then has a patty chamber. And it has another chamber right next to the chamber in ruins with about an 8-ton roof slab that's fallen on its side. And most of the structure is missing today. We think he consumed some of that when he put his house in there. And there's a couple other chambers on the south side so it's like a courtyard surrounded by buildings at one time. And he put in a central wall. Today he used lolly columns, and there's a stone staircase that went into this courtyard, and he blocked that off. And he was also an abolitionist. He had the slaves coming through there, and there's that may help to prove that it's a manacle that was found there. We had that on display. And Wilbur Seibert, who wrote The Underground of Ohio, Massachusetts, and New York, he talks about Patty and how Patty would have, in secrecy, have the slaves brought to his place in Shawshene Village in Massachusetts by a Mr. Poor and a Mr. Hussey and a horse named Nellie, I think it was, in the middle of the night. And they would go stay at our place for a while, and then they would travel to another place in New Hampshire, eventually making their way to Canada. So he was an abolitionist. He was a tax collector. He had the site dismantled, from what we can tell. And so they weren't really building the site. They were actually causing some damage to it. So the Patties were there until the house burnt down in 1855, and Mr. Patty had died in 1849. And then the Patty family still owned the land for a while, and we think they took the remains of the house that didn't burn and recycled it into a house at the bottom of our hill, and the house is still standing today. And about 100 years ago, there's a picture of the Patty family standing in that house, which we think part of it came from on top of the hill originally. So Patties were around Salem. There's Patty's Cabin in Salem. There's Patty Street in Salem. And Marquis de Lafayette, the famous general of Washington, had stayed at the Patty Cabin. And we think he actually visited Jonathan back in around 1824. So that's kind of interesting. We haven't completely confirmed that yet, but he did stay at the Patty Cabin in Salem.
Wow. Well, it's fascinating how it has survived, and it's a testimony to your family's dedication to it, actually, because there are so many of them that have been absolutely destroyed, and as I said before, taken apart for patios or foundations to houses and things like that. And I truly believe that the reason the stone chambers in New England, especially around where I am in the upper New York and Connecticut area, have survived is because we have, I think, the rockiest ground in the world here. And so it wasn't good for anything, so people didn't bother to take apart the chambers, and the chambers are still standing. But the scary thing, and somebody did ask if there are any pictures, and if you guys go to my website, BarbaraDeLong.com, to Secrets of the Stones, and then you go to the photos of the stone chambers in New Hampshire, almost all of those were taken at American Stonehenge, and they're beautiful chambers. They are just the most unbelievably constructed chambers you've ever seen, and as I said before, there's no telling exactly what they were built for. The ones that I've been in, had no artifacts found near them, none at all. And so that it's always been, people have said, well, they were used for storing food, and no, they weren't. There was no door and there was no ventilation, or that people have used them for garages. Other people have said that they were burial chambers. And as a medium and an intuitive, I have never felt that there had been a burial in any of them. And there's never in the ones that I have been in, there have never been any artifacts of any sort found. So that it's sort of like there's no pottery, and every now and then they will find a fire pit of some sort, and at that point they can carbon date that, and they mostly have been dated back 2,000, 3,000 years before BC. Not 2,000 years, but it would be like 4,000 years from now. So that they're ancient. They're absolutely ancient, and they're not being preserved. And I find it interesting that all around us we have colonial villages that are preserved, and everybody thinks, isn't it wonderful? This is our history. And here we have something that is so much more of an ancient antiquity, like a pyramid, and they ignore them. They don't put that much effort into preserving them or talking about them or investigating them. And certainly something as extensive as what you've got merits a little bit of, I would think that you would be able to get some sort of government grants to sort of investigate and see just where they came from, or how they were made, or why they were there, or how long they've been standing there. And if what you have now is what is cleared, I really, really wonder what is still under the ground that hasn't been cleared away, because, we're talking 4,000 years here. So a lot of dirt can be made in 4,000 years.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, like I was mentioning, I think 99% of the hilltop at our site has not been, looked at yet, excavated. In the 1990s, however, they did do a study of what they call shovel test pits, or STPs. You went out with a shovel, and you dig a hole about 50 centimeters in diameter, and you go down to hit bedrock, or what they call a pre-occupational level, like glacial soil or something like that. And then you record all the data. And they did we have almost 110 acres there. They did almost one per acre. I think they did maybe 90 or 95 of them. And it took several years to do this, and they were mapping the hilltop, and they found, some, like I mentioned, some charcoal and wigwam site and some other things. But they also found geologically, probably the hilltop was 75% there about 4,000 years ago. So you're looking at a pretty bald hill up there with some glacial soil and brush. So the ancient people may have not had the tree problem, because they could have cut down trees. We had found stone axes. They could have burned it down, as you mentioned, like Native Americans could clear an area out by burning, or just a natural fire. And actually those are good too, because they leave charcoal behind, and then that becomes something datable, So we have on a couple of levels or horizons of charcoal up there to actually date the site and the walls, So that's been actually a great help. But I think it's a pretty bare hill, and when they built our site, they didn't just throw the stone structures up haphazardly, of course. They actually created a whole network of underground drains, and some of the drains are up to 75 feet long. They did it two different ways. They channeled the bedrock, and they actually carved into the bedrock, and that's like we were talking about how hard that granite is. They actually created these channels to the bedrock, and generally these channels lead to underground man-made drains. They created drains by two parallel rows of stone, or like two little walls, and they put flat stones on top as roofs. Some of these kids get climbed through, actually. And without oil on the hill 4,000 years ago, not only could you see the alignments, the astronomical alignments quite clearly, when it rained or if it snowed and you had the problem with snow melting, you didn't have the soil or trees or vegetation to soak up the water. You needed these drains to get rid of it, and that may have been the reason that they did all this drainage. So they took the time to do this before they actually built the chambers above these drains. So they put a lot of thought into this thing, I think, and it wasn't done overnight. So so I think those are pieces of evidence, that the hilltop was pretty open at that time. And but the drains themselves are pretty interesting, and that's where we do find a few artifacts inside the drains, just like in this kitchen sink or things go into it, and we have found a few artifacts inside these drains. But not all of them have been excavated yet either.
Has there been any effort made to see, I keep and for what it's worth, I keep getting the feeling that it was almost as though it was a watchtower. Now, if that's the case, it would seem to me that there would, you know how, at least in China, they would set up watchtowers that could light fires that, they'd see the smoke and they'd light the fire, and they'd see the smoke and they'd light the fire, and they'd see the smoke and they'd light the fire. Is there a pattern where your site might be linked to other sites, or is it just a standalone and there's nothing else out there except, England Stonehenge? It just seems like it was set up to be not a fortress or a fort, because we saw, especially at Gunjiwamp, they have walls there that were 15, 16 feet high, and they were a good 8 feet deep, and they ran probably about, I guess a couple hundred feet, and you don't know if that was something that they hid behind. You don't know if it was to keep something in or to keep something out, but I didn't notice any stone walls there that were anywhere near that high, and I'm wondering, have you taken some of the walls that are there, because there were walls there, I do recall, have you dug down to see if the wall is actually taller than you think?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Yeah, the walls are, they have been a couple excavations over the years, and the walls are higher than they appear because, as we were mentioning, the soil building up. And remember, one area to the southwest, still inside the chain link fence area, they were working on a wall, and they wondered if this particular wall could have been something Patty had put up as a carriage house or a barn or shed. And they found no historic, they found no nails, they found nothing historic in that dig. But they did find the soil was about 18 inches, and it did appear to be undisturbed. So the wall was there first, and the soil has been building up. And 18 inches could represent over 1,000 years of soil accumulation. Like I mentioned before, it's about an inch every 100 years, but that's just an average. And on the hill, you have washing. The hill gets washed too. Things erode from the hill. So it was about 18 inches. So the wall was like, wow, it's a higher wall than we thought it was. If you're standing on the original bedrock, the wall would be up to here instead of here on you. That kind of thing. And I'm sure some of the walls, the stones have fallen off, but it doesn't appear to us that the site was like fortified, as you mentioned. It just doesn't give you that sense. The walls aren't that tall, and it doesn't seem to be it is on a hill. It has two cliff shelters, one to the west and one to the north. And if you're going to fortify it, those would definitely be something, you'd be running very tall walls along by those. We have walls out by the cliffs, but not these tall walls to keep people from coming over or anything like that. So that's a question that's brought up a lot. And it just doesn't seem to have that feel that it was a fortified kind of site. We think more of the site probably was, probably more of a sacred kind of thing, maybe burial, maybe they had celebrations during the sunrise and sunsets, that kind of thing.
Well, now you're going back 2,000, 4,000 years. You're going back a long, long way. And during that time frame, certainly the water levels of the oceans and everything were different. So how, was the water perhaps closer during that time frame? I mean, the water levels have certainly risen and fallen a number of times here.
Oh, right, exactly. We had a gentleman. He was retired from Harvard. He was doing investigation on the site. And one of the things he was interested in was water levels, and he drew out many, many maps. We went to the USGS up in Pembroke, New Hampshire, that covers New Hampshire and Vermont. We talked to the people up there, and we were just getting in the archaeologist. Her husband were at the Tufts, but unfortunately he passed away in an auto accident. He was just retiring after 30 years with Tufts University. They traveled to Egypt. They traveled to Alaska, all over the world, and he was getting real interested in our site, and we had a lot of questions about water levels. One thing we have found, and I don't know how accurate it is, they said that about 4,000 years ago, the ocean level relative to the land in our area would be about 43 feet. What has happened, I guess, talking to geologists, is that during the last glacial maximum, around 18 or 19,000 years ago, there was about a half a mile to a mile of ice above us, and it actually compressed the land down between a quarter and a half a mile. And after the ice melted, because the oceans began rising because they warm up and because of the additional water going into them from the ice, and the land starts coming back up also. It's like a sponge, taking your hand off a sponge. And that's why in New England we always have earthquakes. The land is still rebounding, I guess, from from that glacial period. And there's earthquakes every year. And we had actually a printout from over 100 years of magnitude and epicenter of earthquakes in New England. It just almost constantly what they call earth tremors, but they're actually earthquakes. And so the water level was actually 43 feet higher, so the water was in closer to our site. We're about 21 statute miles from the Atlantic Ocean. The Merrimack River would have been higher, and the mouth of it, I guess, would have been closer to us because the ocean would have come in further, you know. So that's a good question, and so our site isn't that far from the ocean, and on the east side of our site is the swampland, the ponds, and brooks. And we think 4,000 years ago it wasn't silted in, and also because the land has risen a little bit, today you couldn't bring a boat in there. You might be able to bring in a small canoe or something in there, but you couldn't bring a big boat in. But 4,000 years ago, I think, before all the erosion brought silt in there and before the land rose a little bit, you probably had access to the east side of our site. On the west side is the Spicker River, as we mentioned before. So those are really big questions, and we do have some maps we put up for people to give an idea of what it might have looked like. You might have been able to look from our hill into a bay, actually, which would have gone out to the ocean at that time.
Fascinating. But you know, again, no artifacts. That's what really gets to me. It seems to me, I want to go in with a bulldozer, and I know that's not appropriate. But you know, you do wonder, taking core samples or something to go down, however many feet that would be appropriate, because it does feel going down towards where the water would have been a logical place to look to see if. And have you found any bones of any sort there at all?
We have found a couple bones in the watch house. Actually, there's a tour at our place. It's called the Watch House, and it's actually located at the beginning of a double-walled path. It's almost like a sacred way that takes you up to the main site. And on the opposite side of the hill is also another pathway, and they both converge. But the Watch House in the 1950s, they were doing work inside the structure. They were digging it, and they found a piece of bone in there, and they sent it to a museum, and they looked at it. They didn't carbon date it. That was something that was fairly new back then, the carbon dating process, but they didn't do it. They said it might be bison, which is interesting, or buffalo. And then later they found another piece of bone in there and had a little drill hole through it. And also they found a little stone, triangular piece of stone. It was very, very thin, about an inch long, and had a drill hole. It's like pendants, two little pendants, bone and stone pendant that were found inside the watch house. The soil in our area is quite acidic, so bones don't last more than a few hundred years, up to 1,000 years. But sometimes, if it's protected, you know, I mean, animals eat them too. Animals will get in there and gnaw on them, and they go pretty quickly. But it might have been preserved because of the chamber. The chamber may have helped to keep it dry, and also there's clay there in that area. Maybe that helped to protect those two particular pieces of bone, actually.
Because you would think that it's a large site, so that in some ways there were great numbers of people that probably visited it. It wasn't somebody's country home. I mean, it wasn't like Machu Picchu where, you know, an emperor went and spent his holidays or whatever. So it was used for something. And if it was ritualistic, or if they did make sacrifices, it would only stand to reason that there would be bones of some sort scattered around there, be they human or be they animal. And to not find any really, is unusual.
Yeah, I think the soil, the soil would probably cause the bones to rot basically and disintegrate. But there are two structures there that do resemble tombs over in Europe, particularly in Ireland, but also in France and the Netherlands. And one of them I mentioned before is the V hut. And the V hut, it's shaped like a V if you look down at it like a plan view, and it faces southwest. It's the only structure on the site that doesn't face north, south, east, or west out of true north. And that structure looks, we went to Ireland in 1983, my dad and I did, and we went and explored some of the ruins over there. There's so many of them. We didn't have time to see only a small percentage of them, but we did get a chance to see some of the wedge tombs, and they do face south, same orientation. And the only little difference I noticed was their wedge tombs, some of them have a flat back wall where ours is basically a V shape. There were a couple over there that didn't have that flat back wall, but they're about a meter high like ours. They always face southwest, and ours faces southwest. Just next to that structure is the east-west chamber, and it resembles to me the gallery graves found in the Netherlands and France and also northwest Ireland. And I did visit the one near Karnak, and it runs true east and west, and they always run roughly 20 feet up to about 60 feet in length. And they were used as tombs also. And they're in the Netherlands. They have a funny Dutch name I can't pronounce. But they always have this same size and orientation,
Are you talking about the passage tombs?
Well, there's passage tombs also, yeah. I know that when you start Googling and all this, they come up with all these different types of structures. They actually list them and they have a name for them. But this would be like the gallery graves, and they're kind of rectangular in shape. And like I say, they always run east and west out of true north. And the one near France is right near Karnak, actually. And one other chamber I did see there, my wife and I, when we got out there, when we got to the railroad station, we rented bikes and we went out looking at Karnak and all the roads. It was really wonderful. And as we were riding along, saw a sign, I took a quick left. She went straight, and I yelled at her. I thought she heard me, and she kept going. We didn't see each other for another 4 or 5 hours back at the hotel. She wasn't very happy with me. And I didn't have the camera. She had the camera. And when I saw this chamber, it was, I didn't know what to expect. And I went in there, and it looked like our chamber, the chamber in ruins, the one with our roof slab caved in, except this one had the roof still intact. It was rectangular. It had a doorway like ours. It was just the same type of shape and everything. And every time I Google Karnak, you can't find it. I rack my brains trying to find it so I can get a picture of it off the internet. I guess we'll have to go back over there and see this. But you'll see the gallery grave. You'll see all the rows of stones and everything. And the Grand Bezzy men had a big 68-foot stone that's fallen, but can't find the chamber, and it looks like ours. It's pretty frustrating every time I try to go into that and find it.
I can imagine. Yeah, that would definitely bug me. I think we have I don't know 10,000 pictures of chambers and walls and stuff like that, and I knew that we had one particular one, and I went crazy. I went absolutely nuts trying to find the ones of that I knew were absolutely America's Stonehenge, and I found some of them, and I put them on the scroll. But it's amazing how unique and individual, and what boggles your mind is they did it without any mortar of any sort, and they are still standing after 4,000 years. Now there's got to be a reason they're still there.
It's amazing, dry stone construction. They were good masons, that's for sure. Yeah.
And I can promise you, none of the colonials that came over were stonemasons to that degree. And they didn't have time. They just didn't have the time to. I mean, they made their cabins and their dwellings out of wood, so that there was no reason to construct anything like this. So, it makes you wonder. There was plenty of wood around, and anybody who was here could have made a dwelling out of wood. And, of course, that dwelling would no longer be here because it would have rotted long before now. But if indeed, when was the last Stone Age? Ice Age.
Yeah, there are 4 of them, and the last one of Wisconsin was the last glacial maximum was around 19,000. It ended around 12,000 years roughly, but there's still effects later in time. Even today, we're still having the effects of the earthquakes. So
Oh, okay.
And,
It hasn't gone through an ice age.
Not at all. No. No.
Okay, because that really does scrape the hell out of the earth. But
Oh, definitely.
But you know,
we have glacial striations up there. We have that to show people too. It's a geological thing, but we have the markings where the glaciers actually scratch the bedrock up there. So that's another thing you can see besides the earthquake fault line and the glacial boulders that are up there that are so cool. We think we have a dolmen up there too. We ran that ground penetration radar over the fall equinox alignment, and it's a collinear alignment. It has several actually stones and a big boulder all lined up, and a professor from Penn State, Dr. Winkler, he passed away about that, but he was really getting involved with our site and all. He taught at Penn State since '64 all the way up to about 2000 when he retired around that time period. And he was an archaeoastronomer, studying ancient sites, and he got really fascinated with our site, and he worked on that on a couple of star alignments, but that equinox alignment for the sunset has 4 stones, but the biggest one is the boulder, and we ran ground penetration radar over it during the 90s, and they said the stone is not sitting on bedrock. It's elevated above the bedrock, and there seems to be some stones under it. Until we dig it, we won't know if it's a dolmen. It could be a dolmen, and all the earth is just kind of is built up around it, and you can't tell today whether it's whether it is a dolmen or not. So that's something we should excavate. But the radar seemed to indicate it wasn't sitting on the bedrock, which was like, wow, well, that's really interesting,
Yeah, it just feels like there's so much there yet to be discovered that and I know that you're doing it the right way. You're bringing in professionals to do it, and you're keeping everything documented, and you're going slowly about it. That would drive me crazy. I'd be out.
Sometimes too. Yeah, you have to have patience, a lot of patience, because some of these things we've known for 2 decades, and we haven't got back to them yet. Like that chamber that might be under the ground there, the boulder. We could easily go out there with a shovel, and of course anything archaeological is kind of destructive in a way, as you know. The ground penetration radar would be such a valuable tool. It's very expensive, and if we could get somebody back there with that again, and with the technology it has today, it's like almost like Superman vision. You can actually see, and it's much better than it was in the 90s. And then if you need to do an archaeological dig, then you know exactly what you're going for, would make it kind of neat,
Yeah, I mean, if you know that it's not sitting on bedrock, if you know that there are other stones under it,
mm-hmm.
I mean, I understand that you have to be careful, and I mean, I've seen them with their little trowels and their toothbrushes taking away a grain of sand at a time. Now, it would take you forever to do that, but it's appropriate and to make sure that you get whatever artifacts are around it. But it seems to me that depending on how deep it goes, you would have some idea as to the layer of dirt that needs to be removed to be able to see what else is there.
Yeah, the radar would show that. And then I think they could probably do a shovel test pit, which is a much quicker way, with a shovel actually shoveling down. They're still doing it carefully, but it's kind of a quick way of doing it. And of course, if they find something, it would stop, and they'd have to lay out the proper, grid, in the quadrants and start digging with a toothbrush and trowel at that point. But I know we get frustrated sometimes too. I'd love to get up there myself, but I'm not qualified, and I certainly wouldn't want to make a mess out of it, which it would too, Like, look what I found.
Well,
yeah, but you messed it up,
Yeah, well, you're the kind of person that really should own something like this, because I would be there with a pickaxe and a shovel and a heartbeat.
And there's a lot of people that want to do that. I know that, and believe me, I would love to. I do think that it's going to make it. I don't know if the word's easier, but it's going to be really good. You can go up there, you can see these things, and say, okay, this is a spot. Now we can do a dig here. Because it's like finding a needle in a haystack on 110 acres where you start digging. Mr. Goodwin knew because he was right in the middle of the site. And in fact, he found so many artifacts the first year with his crew that they didn't have time to catalog them or study them. They just set them aside. So they did find a lot of artifacts, probably some historic and some prehistoric. But a point you made, too, is the site isn't that full of artifacts as though it was like a living place. And that's a problem in European sites, like even Stonehenge has some artifacts. But those sites over there are something like 50,000 megalithic sites in Europe, scattered across Europe. They say most of them are pretty clean archaeologically, and that's a problem for archaeologists. They love to find artifacts, so it tells a whole story about these people, And when it's clean like that, it makes it so much difficult to interpret how these people lived, who these people were, everything, And that's a problem over there, too. We have the same problem over here, basically. So they probably lived in hide wood or bark houses, And like you said, those things rot and they're gone. I think they probably were at the bottom of the hill near these rivers, And where do you look along the river? There are homes down there today, modern homes. You'd have to dig in their front yard, And they probably shoot them.
Well, there are people that do that actually. But I actually, was wondering, did you find arrowheads or anything like that there?
Yes, we have found a couple of, we found a nice axe. It's labeled as an Algonquin axe. We found an adze. We found that stone hoe, which still has its little stem, so you could attach it to a shaft. It's a beautiful stone hoe. I think that was found by Mr. Goodwin's crew back in the 30s. And we found a couple of projectile points, and one of them was an arrowhead. And what happened is they must have used it, shot an animal, I presume, and it probably broke. And so what they did is they refashioned it into a knife. They actually dressed it back into a knife, So they recycled that broken arrowhead. They didn't waste anything over us. But yes, we have found that type of thing. So we found stone tools, utensils, and weapons on the site. Some of them were for building the site, like hammer stones, rubbing stones, Rubbing stones probably more for hide or something like that. But stone tools, so Stone Age tools have been found on the site, for sure.
Wow. I just, it boggles my mind. Now, you're working with NERA, which is New England's, I forget what NERA means, but it's the organization that preserves the stone
Antiquities, Research Association, Yeah, my dad actually started that in 1964, so it's been a non-profit organization because our business was open in 58 as a for-profit, but the non-profit was open specifically for research, in 1964. And the Early Sites Foundation had just closed. They're the ones with the National Geographic that worked on that worked on the Lonzo Mill. But they also worked on our site. The Early Sites Foundation worked on our site, not the National Geographic. But they're the ones that found the Viking site together, those two organizations up there in Canada. So some of the members had passed away, and by 63 or 64, the organization was ended, and then NERA took over at that point. So they've had 50 years. This is a big anniversary year.
Wow. Well, now, I know you work with them, and I know you work with any organization that will help you to preserve it. Do you have any upcoming events that you're going to be speaking at or going to?
Well, I was supposed to speak at the NERA conference is in Nashville, New Hampshire, which is just down the street from us, and they have it all over New England. Have it in Danbury, Connecticut, down in your area. Not too long ago, they had it up in Maine and Portland, not too long ago, and this one will be in Nashville, and that will be the 50th anniversary celebration. The spring meeting, I think that was down in your area, the spring meeting, or it might have been Rhode Island. 2 meetings a year, and the meetings the last one was well attended in the spring, and it was the 50th anniversary. But this fall is going to be a big birthday party, I guess, of NERA. And I was supposed to speak at that, and I'm still trying to, but the airline job I have, they moved my I have some new training I have to do down in Dallas, and so I may actually miss that, which I'm not going to be too happy about because it's something special. This was started by my dad. My dad passed away 4 years ago, and he's the one with about 4 or 5 members that started it in our basement up in Derry, New Hampshire back in '64. And I remember as a kid going downstairs in our playroom, that's where they had the meetings on our bunk beds and tables down there, and I'd sit in on the meetings back then. And I think my uncle, he's 93, he was a World War II Air Force, Army Air Corps pilot. He got shot down. He flew B-17s. He's probably the only NERA member that's still living. He's 93 years old, and I was going to see if I could get him to the meeting, too. I don't know if that's possible. But he's like the only living guy that was there during the beginning of NERA. The president now is out of Canada, so we have our first Canadian president of NERA. He's out of Halifax, Canada. So it's not just the U.S. It's in Canada, and it covers. It's not just New England. They were thinking of changing the name to the Northeast Antiquities Research or something like that at one time, because it really is covering a big part of the country now. The sites are all over the place.
Yeah, they do a good job in helping to draw attention to the sites. I just it saddens me to see so many of the sites ignored, and I've been to a number of the huge balanced rocks that are all over the place, and again, a piece of history that it defies explanation. There's no way of knowing how these balanced rocks are balanced, and yet they are. And frankly, I've tried to push one over, and it's solid, and it's balanced on a single point, and it's there forever. Whatever kind of glue they used worked really, really well. And I have a book about Salem, Massachusetts, that my great-grandfather wrote, and it talked about the balanced stone that was in that area during that time. That was in the 1800s, and it's still there. It's still there to this day, but it's ignored. They kind of have, if they could have shoved it into an alleyway someplace, I think they would have. It just feels to me as though there is no interest in the past anymore. It's all focused on the future. And if we don't understand our past, if we don't have a really good idea of where we've come from and what we are building on as far as a foundation for civilization, we lose so much. And I once was thinking, okay, so Egypt has the pyramids, and they've been around for 10,000, 12,000 years, and they are a testimony to a time in history. And what do we actually have? If you took everybody off the planet all at once and you just let everything sit, in 10,000 years, pyramids would still probably be there, but the only thing I figured that would be here is maybe Mount Rushmore and whatever stone chambers are left behind. And that's it. And it tells nothing of who was here or what we did or what kind of legacy we left to those who would come after us. And it's frightening. It really is. I think that these stone chambers and especially American Stonehenge has a history that has to be found. And to just have to say, well, we don't know, but here it is, isn't enough for me. I want to know, what is it? How can we find it? I mean, with all of our technology today, with cell phones and everything else, why can't we find out where it came from or why it's there or how it was built? Because, frankly, the time frame you're talking about having it built, there weren't a whole bunch of strong pack animals like bison or horses that could have dragged those rocks around. They just didn't exist at that particular point in time. So how were those stones put in place? And especially the lintels, the roof pieces, the roof stones, they're huge. And people have to see them to believe them. I know that a whole bunch of guys got together and tried to lift a couple of the rocks that were around one of the stone chambers here, and they got 12 guys, and they couldn't budge it. So how did these people put these huge stones together in a manner and a way that had no mortar and hasn't been able to be knocked down for 4,000 years? How did it happen?
Well, that was a very, very, very good point. The amount of craftsmanship that went into them, the expertise in stonemasons, and then the time. Time is valuable. These because our forefathers were practical. They wouldn't have wasted the time, as you mentioned earlier. But yeah, these things are permanent. They built to last almost forever. And so it's a real testimony to these ancient people. They were able to do this, and they had probably division of labor. They were organized. And certainly were skilled at coring. Just getting the stones off the bedrock is a big project. And then they did a thing called dressing the stone, shaping these stones. We have roof slabs that have lap joints on them on our site, and they actually interconnect. They actually like working with wood almost, and you're able to create a 90-degree cutout and make a lip in the stone that actually fits into the stone next to it, so they interlock, And, look at that, I'm like, wow, I don't think I could do any of that, and we've been around that thing for 50-something years looking at that, and we have a professional stonemason, and he sometimes shakes his head and goes, I don't even know how to get these big slabs off the bedrock in one big piece, because every time you try to, do something like that, the stone will break, it will fracture, and you end up with pieces of stone. He goes, it's something we haven't quite figured out. We have some good guesses, but we don't know if that's how they did it and whether it would actually work or not. So,
well, not only that, but to get it from where it was quarried to where it was laid, I mean, it's almost the same story as the Great Pyramid. They did not drag these things across the ground because that would have destroyed them. And they didn't have horses. They didn't have the animals, the pack animals. They didn't have anything strong enough to do that. And they didn't have pulleys and levers and stuff like that. They didn't have come-abouts. They didn't have all of the modern technology that, we have today. So
the hydraulics and cranes and all of that. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, none of that. They had none of that. And I don't for a moment, I'm not suggesting that. Well, yes, I am, kind of. Giants were here. Giants could have lifted those stones, but they're too small.
You wonder, how they did it, and maybe there's a different race, because those legends keep turning up with some actual bones too. I guess skeletal remains. They found. So you wonder if that has something to do with these monster stones. I know at Stonehenge they moved some of the stones, the 50-ton stones, from Marlborough Downs. I think that's about 15 miles. A 50-ton stone across. How did they do that? It's just. And then they had some from Wales they moved down there, which is that's well over 100-something miles away, And
exactly.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Yeah.
And they didn't have. I mean, you can't tell me they had gangs of thousands of soldiers or slaves or whatever dragging them. That wasn't going to happen during that time. It just wasn't. So, and you look at them and you think, and not only that, but they're so with the corbelled construction with the chambers that are down in my area. How did they get the lintels up without the walls falling down? And once it was all braced, it looks as though they may have covered them with fine sand to see if there were any leaks, because every stone chamber I've been in was watertight. There were no leaks, and they were dry as a bone inside, and it was phenomenal. And we saw a couple of chambers that had the fine sand that was over the tops that had collapsed, and the fine sand had poured into the chamber. So Patrick and I figured that they got the sand and they poured it all over this thing to make sure that it was sealed tight, and then they covered that with soil. And and the stone chambers down here, there are very few stone chambers that are not attached to stone walls. So that there was almost a linkage of the stone chambers by the stone walls. So there had to be a point to them. And because this area has chambers that are so much like yours, you have to think that they were done about the same time frame. And I know the ones that were on in one of the national forests down here, they did have, Gunjiwamp was tested to about the same time frame, about 4,000 years ago. They tested a charcoal pit there, and they got about the same time frame. So, it was a culture of people that lived 4,000 years ago that there's no sign of anymore at all. And it was, they were amazing. So you sit back and you think, where did they go, or why did they go? Because 15,000 years ago, when the Native Americans came, they weren't here, but the chambers were here. So you have to say that the chambers, predated that, and you just kind of shake your head. And I hate having something that I don't have the answer to. It just bugs the daylights out of me. And
that's what keeps us all going too. Not having the answer. We don't have any conclusive evidence or answer yet. In the Gunjawamp you mentioned, we have the watch house I mentioned, and there's about 50 structures like that in New England with a large glacial boulder with a structure built to the left side of it. And the one at Gunjawamp looks kind of like that. And there's also, we have a shark tooth wall that runs between our summer solstice sunrise and our equinox sunrise. We call it the shark tooth. There's all these vertical stones stood up. It's really unusual walls, totally unusual. And it's a little bit like the one in Gunjawamp. I think I saw your documentary, and you had some excellent photographs, and that was very, very well done, by the way. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to show it to all the people at our museum, and I'll tell our guests about it for sure. But that was a great picture in there, too, of Gunjawamp with the standing stone, too. You showed both the structure with the boulder, and you showed the standing stones there. And, there's a little bit of a resemblance between those features between both sites. So I thought I'd throw that out there. But
yeah, no, it feels like it was the same culture that did both sites, and while they look primitive, they aren't. And there is one chamber down here someplace in New York State. I know we saw it. And while most of the chambers have the huge lentil stones over the top, this particular chamber has the stones pointed down, almost like stalactites and stalagmites. And it's amazing. It looks like they're chandeliers, and I have to admit I tried to pull one down, and they're in there tight. They're not going anywhere. So it's kind of like it's they were built to last, and was it a culture that planned on coming back? I mean, were they interdimensional beings? Were they part of the UFO fleet that got left behind? Were they? I mean, you can go with really weird stuff, but it does feel as though there is a strata of our history that we don't know anything about, and that people like you are at least preserving the proof of that, while everybody else destroys it in the name of progress. And I shudder to think, but I would bet in another 20 years the number of the stone chambers that are here in New England will have gone from the 200 maybe down to 25 or 30. And it's so sad to think that there used to be thousands of them, and now there are only a couple hundred. And not everybody is as attuned to the history as you are, and it's pathetic. Because I'm sure
like it's things you're doing, like your show and your documentary, that I think will help an awful lot. And trying to get people educated. People aren't even aware of these structures, as you mentioned. And if some people are aware of them, they don't understand what these structures might mean. But a lot of people that come to our site, we never heard. For the last 50-something years, we've been open 56 years. Oh, we never knew anything like this existed. So there's that out there for one thing. And then the other thing is some people have heard of it and said, I didn't know it was anything like this, and then they start to get interested in it. So it's an educational thing, to get the public, get people interested, get the school systems interested. That's what we try to do. You mentioned, do the people intend to come back to our site? I'll just throw a little thing in there. The oracle chamber, which is next to the sacrificial table, does have a tube, and it runs from the oracle chamber to the table horizontally. We think it was used as a speaking tube, perhaps, and there's a step below it. So somebody about 5.5 feet tall can stand on that step inside the oracle chamber, and nobody outside above the table, there's a platform, a stone platform, could actually see the oracle chamber. It's kind of like there's a ridge that runs across the hill, and they continued that ridge artificially by making the oracle chamber. When Goodwin came and he found the table was sitting on legs when he went down, he also found, eventually, they were working around there, and he found a loose stone. They pulled it out, and there's the oracle tube. And they went to the other side, maybe inside the oracle chamber. I think they might have found the outside one. They found another plug, and it looked like these people, whoever left the place, closed the place down, and they plugged up the oracle tube so in case somebody should venture in there, they wouldn't see it. They wouldn't know that it was like the Wizard of Oz. They didn't want anybody knowing that somebody was in here yelling, and it wasn't a god or spirit talking to them, the voice coming out under the table. So it's almost like they closed the place down. And that's another little kind of like a piece of evidence, and it's kind of a mystery, you know. Is that their intention to conduct the music?
That chamber that is right by the sacrificial table also has niches in the wall where you could, I don't know, put a candle or you know, a picture of your boyfriend or whatever. But it looked like there were actually little ledges in there that were made so that you could put things on them or in them. And
there's a lot in there. Yeah, there is a lot. Absolutely, and there's a lot of cheese in there. Yeah, in that chamber. Yeah, a lot of work went into that.
Oh my God, yes. And you know, you sit and you think, okay, how cool. How long did it take them to do this? That, you know, their tools were primitive at best.
There's a lot of work, a lot of time, and a lot of designing to it. Yeah, definitely. They didn't just throw that in the core building on top of the roof of that exit.
Oh, yeah.
But you're right. There are closets. There's carvings. There's two drains to keep the structure dry. And the roof had a chimney, it appears. In the 1958, when we opened, the stone movers are still there. We have photographs of 2 stone movers that would be used to adjust the draft. Somebody stole them, and they've been gone ever since 1958. We don't know if it was used. There's not much evidence of firing in that at all, or charcoal or anything, so it may have been something they only used once in a great while, and maybe during a ceremony smoke would be coming out of the ground there, you know, and they adjusted those 2 little stones that would actually pivot, like a damper in the stove, kind of.
Oh, wow.
And but they're missing today, so even they had that feature. And there's a bed in there too. It goes in about 8 feet right below the speak tube, and there's a little window, a stone window, an opening where you could actually look out and look into the chamber. And the entrance that you walked in when you visited us was not as it is today. It's open above your head. It was all enclosed. There was a stone roof. We still have photographs of it being totally roofed over. So it really did conceal the chamber. If you stood up with people would watch a ceremony on the table, perhaps, you would not know that chamber was there. It was all concealed, you know, and only the builders and the priest or shaman or whoever was there would know about that, you know. So it was a Wizard of Oz kind of thing possibly going on with that table and the speaking tube.
Well, it has so much energy to it, and there is so much there. And, you know, you can walk through the site reasonably fast, but if you take your time to look at the workmanship that has gone into it, you realize that there were, decades and decades and decades of work that went into the creation of this site. And I strongly suspect that there's a lot more that's yet to be found. I don't think that you've even, pardon the expression, scratched the surface yet. So,
you thought just like my dad. My dad said that. Even towards the end of his life, he says, I think we just scratched the surface here, you know. So he felt the same way over the decades that he was involved with it, too, and I feel that way, too, you know. And hopefully modern technology helps to speed that up a little bit, you know.
Well, thank God you've got a son that can come after you and preserve, you know, and keep going with it, because, you know, without a family like yours to preserve it, it doesn't stand a chance.
No, thank you so much. Yeah, he's very interested in. He's an engineer also. He got his business degree and engineering degree, and he's doing engineering right now. But he, just like my dad was an engineer, you know, and but yeah, he's very much he's getting into it more and more. You know, interested in. We talked to my wife about, you know, eventually, you know, retiring to it too, you know, and keeping it. It is a state historic site, but it, you know, we've had it in our family since 1958. So the state recognizes us, but. And some of the other sites around are slowly getting some recognition, but there is that chance that some of these will be bulldozed for progress. One up in Massachusetts, fortunately, was just saved recently from a housing development, and the builder actually was quite good. They worked it out with the town. He sold it back to the town, and now it's a park. And it's the original guy that owned our site. I should say Malcolm Pearson, who had the site when my dad bought it back in got involved with it. Malcolm just died at 99 years old just a couple of years ago, but his family purchased that. It looks like a passage grave, and now it's the Upton Pearson Chamber, I think, in park. It's actually a park, so people can go visit it. The town spent a lot of money to buy the land, and then they did some restoration to the chamber, and now that's open to the public. So that's just one of the little things that is good, you know. Fortunately, they're saving that structure. That's good.
Yeah, I know the one chamber that we found in Massachusetts was torn down for a parking lot.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
That's
but
bad. Yeah.
we have a question here. Have
Wow.
any of the ancient measurements, like the megalithic yard, been used? Have you been able to
We
determine?
think so. We got involved with that in the 1970s. We actually met Dr. Alexander Thom in Scotland back in 1983, and his son Archibald Thom, and he's the one that discovered, I guess, the megalithic yard, the megalithic inch, and the megalithic rod. And my dad and I, and he was also working on the astronomy of these sites. He was a professor of engineering, University of Oxford, and his son is also a doctor, both doctors, and I believe the grandson's now carrying out the work. But Tom got involved with this back in the 1930s over in Europe, and he went all throughout Western Europe measuring these sites, surveying these sites, and his work is still outstanding today. Even the critics praise him for his accuracy. He found that these people understood the Pythagorean triangle. They understood pi, 3.14, ratio. They knew about the lunar cycle, the 18.61-year lunar cycle. So we were involved with Tom for a while, and unfortunately he passed away in 85, and his son Archibald passed away later. But we started looking in the 70s when we became aware of his work that our site doesn't seem to be based on English measurements. And what we did find, it's preliminary, is megalithic units at our site. My son and I just last year, I think, went up and repeated some of those measurements and came up with the same thing. They seem to be based on megalithic yards, but it's not conclusive. More people have to do more very accurate measuring. You have to know what to measure when you're measuring something too, And yes, it's found at our site. I think the North Salem dolmen seems to have megalithic, and I've heard of a couple other sites in the United States that seem to be based on megalithic measurements also. So yes, we think so, but more work has to be done. That would be a great piece of evidence.
Definitely. Dennis, we got a minute left. I want to thank you so very much for spending the time with us. I really hope that thousands of people listen to this and come and visit Stonehenge in America and up there, and I hope that this does help to bring a little more awareness and a little more attention to something that's very, very important to our history.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, and I'd like to thank your listeners for having us on. And, we're open every day of the year except for Thanksgiving and Christmas. The website's stonehengeusa.com. And I reviewed your documentary, and I found it excellent. I highly recommend that, too. And I want to thank you for what you're doing, too. You're doing an excellent job. And your husband, both of you, are doing an incredible job trying to protect, these sites and make them known to the public. You're doing and educate people. That's great. I appreciate that, too.
We'll keep on plugging. Thanks so much again. and thank you everyone for joining us tonight. This is the kind of interview show I love to do, and there will be more, so keep watching. And then the regular show, of course, and the spiritual development circles and all of that stuff. Check out my website. And thank you again. And Deb, thank you very much. And